The smell hit me first. Motor oil and something sweeter underneath it, like a candle someone had blown out hours ago. I was sitting in the back seat of a car I didn't recognize, my wrists zip-tied in front of me, watching the highway lights streak past the tinted windows like a fever dream. I kept thinking about my brother's face when he'd handed me that coffee that morning, how he'd looked away when I thanked him. He'd known exactly what was in it. My name is Lena, and until 6 months ago, I thought the worst thing that had ever happened to me was losing my mother at 22. I was wrong. The worst thing was finding out that the people I'd spent my whole life trusting had been lying to me from the beginning, and that my mother's death was the reason why. Let me back up. I grew up in a mid-sized house in Columbus, Ohio, the kind of house where the carpets were always slightly damp and the heat went out every January. My mother worked 2 jobs, receptionist at a dental office during the day, weekend shifts at a hotel front desk. My brother was 4 years older than me. He was the one who taught me to ride a bike, who sat with me in the ER the night I broke my wrist falling out of a tree, who called me every Sunday for years after I moved to Chicago for grad school. His name is Scott. I want you to remember that. Scott. After our mother died, heart failure. Sudden, no warning. Scott became the only family I had left. Our father had walked out when I was 3. There were no aunts or uncles we were close to, just Scott and me, and a grief so large it felt like a third person living in the apartment. I moved back to Columbus for a year to be near him. We'd sit on his back porch on warm nights, sharing a 6-pack and talking about her. He'd cry sometimes, which always surprised me because Scott was the kind of man who'd maintained a poker face through our entire childhood. I'd never seen him cry until she died. He seemed so broken by it, so genuinely devastated. I believed every single second of it. What I didn't know was that while I was grieving on that porch beside him, Scott had already started going through her things. Not the jewelry, not the photo albums, the documents. The ones she'd kept in a fireproof lockbox at the back of her closet that I didn't even know existed. I found out later that he'd been inside that box within 72 hours of her funeral. 18 months after she died, I moved back to Chicago. I had a job, junior project manager at an architecture firm, decent salary, good benefits. I had a studio apartment in Wicker Park with a window that looked onto a small courtyard and a cat named Fig who slept on my feet. My life was small and quiet, and I was starting, slowly, to feel okay again. Scott called every Sunday. He visited twice a year. He seemed fine. Then, about 8 months ago, things started to feel slightly off. Little things at first. He'd ask odd questions on our calls. Had I ever gone through Mom's old papers? Did I have any documents she'd given me? Was I in contact with anyone from her side of the family? I'd tell him no, and he'd move on, and I'd forget about it by the next morning. In February, he told me he was having money trouble, real trouble. He'd invested badly, he said, gotten involved with some people he shouldn't have. He needed $40,000. He said he'd pay me back within the year. I didn't have $40,000. I told him that. He said he understood. 2 weeks later, he showed up in Chicago. He took me to dinner at a restaurant downtown, the kind of place he never would have been able to afford on his own, which I noticed but didn't ask about. He ordered a bottle of wine. He was warm and funny and attentive, exactly the brother I'd grown up with. He asked about my job, about my friends, about whether I was seeing anyone. And then, near the end of the meal, he mentioned a man named Hugh Calloway. He said it casually. An investor, he called him. Someone who might be interested in a partnership opportunity that involved a piece of property. He said he'd mentioned me to Hugh, that I might be able to help facilitate something, nothing complicated. He said Hugh was going to be in Chicago the following weekend, and would I be willing to just have a coffee with him? I said sure. He's my brother. I said sure. The coffee meeting was at a hotel in the Gold Coast. I walked in feeling completely normal. I sat across from a man in his late 50s who had the kind of stillness that money buys. No nervous energy, no small talk, just this careful watchfulness that I mistook, at first, for intelligence. We talked for maybe 20 minutes. He asked about my work, my background, my connection to Scott. He didn't mention any partnership. He was just watching me the way you watch something you're considering purchasing. I didn't understand what was happening. Not then. I left that meeting and called Scott from the sidewalk. I told him the man had never mentioned any investment opportunity. I said the whole thing felt strange. Scott laughed it off. He said Hugh was just cautious that he'd wanted to meet me first, that it was a good sign he'd seemed interested. I let it go. I don't know why I let it go. I think because the alternative, that my brother had brought me there for a reason he wasn't telling me, was too frightening to sit with. 3 weeks later, Scott called and said he wanted to take me on a trip. A thank you, he said, for being such a good sister, for always being there. He booked us a long weekend in New Orleans, flights and hotel already paid for. I was touched. I was genuinely touched. The flight was fine. The hotel was in the French Quarter, beautiful. The kind of place with wrought iron balconies and ceiling fans that moved like slow water. Scott was attentive and generous the whole first day. We ate beignets. We walked along the river. He bought me a silver bracelet from a vendor on Royal Street. That night he ordered room service. He insisted on pouring my coffee from the carafe himself. I woke up in a different room. It wasn't a hotel room. It was somewhere older. Plaster walls, a window with wooden shutters that let in thin lines of light. My hands weren't restrained, but my head felt like someone had wrapped it in cotton, soaked in something chemical. I sat up and the room tilted, and I stayed very still until it stopped. There was a woman sitting in a chair by the door. Late 30s, dark hair pulled back, wearing jeans and a blazer like she was attending a casual business meeting. She introduced herself as a kind of, and she actually used this word, which is why it seared into my memory, a kind of facilitator. She explained in a calm voice that terrified me more than screaming would have, that there was a man who wished to meet me, that he had been connected to me through Scott, that I was there to discuss an arrangement. I told her I needed to leave immediately. I told her she needed to let me go right now. She said that would be up to the man I was about to meet. They walked me down a hallway and through a door into a large room, the kind that comes with old Southern money, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, a fireplace with tiles painted blue and white. A man was standing with his back to me, looking out a window that faced a courtyard. When he turned around, I saw his face, and he was not what I had expected. He wasn't cold or frightening looking. He was somewhere around 60, silver-haired with dark eyes that moved to my face and then stopped. He looked at me for a long moment without speaking, and then his eyes dropped to my neck. I was wearing a necklace I'd had on for so long I'd stopped noticing it. A small gold oval on a thin chain the size of a quarter with a pressed flower sealed inside the glass. A forget-me-not, dried and pale. My mother had given it to me when I turned 18. She'd told me it had belonged to her mother and to her mother before that, and that I was to keep it safe. I'd worn it every day for 12 years. It was so much a part of me that I'd gone through airport security with it, slept with it, showered with it. I never took it off. The man in the room went very still. He said, and his voice, when he finally spoke, was almost a whisper, "Where did you get that locket?" I told him my mother gave it to me. He sat down heavily in the chair nearest to him, as if his legs had given out gradually and this was the only graceful way to manage it. He pressed one hand over his mouth. He looked at me for a long time. Then he said, "What was your mother's name?" I told him. The sound he made when I said it was not something I can fully describe. It was too private for me to have witnessed. It was the sound of something in a person coming loose that had been bolted down for decades. He said her name back to me quietly. He said Ruth. That was my mother's name, Ruth. I had not given him a last name. I had only said Ruth. He looked up at me and said, "She was my daughter." I sat down. I don't remember sitting down, but suddenly I was sitting and the woman in the blazer had quietly left the room and there was just the two of us. He told me his name was Franklin, that he and my mother had been estranged for almost 30 years, that when she was 19, she'd left home after a fight that had started over money and ended with things being said that couldn't be unsaid, that he had looked for her for years, that he had hired people to find her twice and both times the leads had gone nowhere. That locket, he said, had been his wife's, my grandmother's. She passed it to Ruth when Ruth turned 16, 2 years before everything fell apart. He said he'd never imagined that Ruth had passed it to a daughter. He hadn't known she had children. I told him about Scott. Something changed in his face. He leaned forward and asked me to tell him everything about how I'd come to be in that room, and I did. The dinner, the coffee meeting, Hugh Calloway, New Orleans. I watched his expression move through something complex and controlled, the way a man moves through anger when he's had 60 years to learn how to manage it. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he picked up the phone on the desk beside him and made a call. I heard him say very calmly, "Bring me everything Scott Hadley gave you, every document, and find me Hugh Calloway." What unfolded over the next 48 hours was something I am still, even now, processing in pieces. Scott had found in my mother's lockbox letters. Letters from Franklin, written over a span of 15 years, sent to an old address, returned unopened, and a document, a letter from a family attorney, dated almost 20 years ago, explaining that as Franklin's only heir, Ruth stood to inherit a significant portion of his estate. If Ruth was deceased, that inheritance would pass to her children. Scott had found out, in other words, that I was a wealthy man's granddaughter, and rather than tell me, he had contacted Hugh Calloway, who was not an investor, but a man with connections to people who specialized in quietly handling inconvenient situations involving family wealth and inheritance disputes. He had sold access to me to someone who intended to, and here I have to stop and say that even now, typing this, I feel the floor shift under me. Someone who intended to have me sign over power of attorney while I was sedated, clearing the path for a legal challenge to Franklin's estate that would route any inheritance away from me and towards Scott through a series of shell accounts Hugh's people had used before. They'd done it before. That was the part that made me feel actually sick. There were records. Franklin's attorney, a man who'd been protecting his interests for decades, had been tracking Hugh Calloway for years as a known bad actor in exactly this kind of financial fraud. Scott had handed me to them for what amounted to a finder's fee and a percentage of whatever they recovered. 20 years of Sunday phone calls, 20 years of porch nights and six-packs and crying together over the mother we'd both lost. He knew what was in that lockbox within 72 hours of her funeral. He'd known for 18 months. He'd had 18 months to call me and say, "Lena, I found something." He'd had 18 months to do the right thing. He'd spent those 18 months building a plan. Franklin did not press charges against Scott immediately. He explained to me, sitting across from me in that room, that he wanted to give me the space to make that decision myself. He said it was my family. He said he'd spent 30 years learning the difference between justice and revenge, and that those two things could look identical from the outside and feel completely different on the inside, and that only the person closest to the wound could know which one they actually needed. I thought about that for a long time. I thought about Scott crying on the back porch. I thought about the way he'd looked away when he handed me the coffee. I pressed charges. I did it because I needed to stand somewhere firm. Because there is a version of forgiveness that comes after accountability and a version that comes instead of it, and I was not yet ready to offer the version that skips the harder step. The legal process took months. There's a civil component and a criminal component and a whole architecture of paperwork I still don't fully understand, handled by Franklin's attorney and a lawyer I retained myself. Scott's attorney argued diminished capacity due to financial stress. The prosecutor argued premeditation. I testified twice. Both times I kept my eyes on the middle distance and spoke clearly and did not let my voice break until I was outside the building. What I want to tell you about is not the legal process. What I want to tell you about is the afternoon, about 3 weeks after I'd first woken up in that room in New Orleans, when Franklin and I sat in his courtyard and he told me about my mother, about the girl she'd been before I knew her, about the fight that had broken everything, about how he'd been wrong, absolutely wrong, and how he'd understood that too late and how he'd carried it like a stone in his chest for 30 years. He said she used to collect things, seeds, feathers, old keys from flea markets. She'd line them up on her windowsill. He said she could name every bird by sound. I told him she still did that. The windowsill thing, she'd done it until the day she died. I thought it was just something she did. He turned his face away from me for a moment. Then he said, "I'm sorry I missed it. All of it. I'm sorry she grew up thinking I didn't want to find her." I said I thought she knew. I said that if she'd kept the locket all those years and given it to me and told me to keep it safe, she must have known, on some level, that she was keeping a door open, that it meant something to her, that it had meant something to him. He didn't say anything for a while after that. We just sat there in the courtyard with the afternoon light coming in through the old iron gate and the sound of traffic somewhere beyond the wall. I want to be honest about what this experience did to me, because I think the easy version of this story ends with the inheritance and the grandfather and a sense of a door opening into something larger. And that part is real. That part happened, and I'm not going to pretend it didn't change things. But I also want to be honest that I am 29 years old and I found out that my brother drugged me and handed me to criminals. That's the ground I'm building on now. That's the foundation everything else sits on top of. I went back to therapy, which I hadn't done since the year after my mother died. My therapist, who is a very direct woman from Minnesota who does not let me be vague about things, told me in our third session that I needed to grieve Scott as a person separate from grieving what he'd done, that those were two different griefs and I was mixing them together and making it harder. She was right. She usually is. I am grieving both. Some days they feel the same. Some days I can separate them. Fig, my cat, is currently sitting on the arm of the chair next to me as I write this. He seems unconcerned about the last 6 months, which I find helpful. I have spoken to Franklin 9 times since New Orleans. We are not close, not yet. Closeness is a thing that takes time, and we are aware of that, I think, in a way that's almost protective. We're being careful with each other. He sends me things sometimes. A photograph of my mother at 15, standing in front of a car, squinting into the sun. A copy of a letter he never sent. I am not naive about what inheriting money from a grandfather I only just met will mean for my life or for the complications inside it. I have a lawyer. I have my therapist. I have 2 friends who know everything and check on me regularly and make me actual meals instead of crackers and resentment. What I want to tell you, if you've gotten this far, the thing I keep coming back to, is this. My mother wore that locket for 30 years. She wore it through 2 jobs and a small damp house and a man who left and 2 children and grief and exhaustion and all the ordinary weight of a life that didn't look, from the outside, like the life of someone carrying a secret inheritance in a gold oval around her neck. She never explained it. She never told me what it meant or who it came from or what she'd left behind to become the woman I knew. But she gave it to me when I turned 18, and she said, "Keep it safe." I have thought about that a lot, what she knew or hoped for or believed on some level that she might not have been able to say out loud. I think she knew I'd need it, not the money, not the grandfather, just a thread, something that led somewhere, something that proved the story was longer than it looked. She was right. She was right about most things, my mother. I just wish she'd had more time to tell me all of them. I keep thinking about the lockbox. Not the money, not the inheritance, not the courtroom, just the image of Scott standing in our mother's bedroom 3 days after we buried her, lifting that fireproof box out of her closet while I was probably downstairs making coffee for the neighbors who had come to sit with us. That's the moment everything actually began. Not New Orleans, not the hotel room, not the drugged coffee. It all started in that bedroom with a choice. He chose wrong, and every single thing that followed was a consequence of that one moment. Not fate, not bad luck, not circumstance. A choice. I've spent a lot of time sitting with that, because it would be easier, honestly, to believe that Scott is just a bad person, that he was always going to do something like this, that I should have seen it coming, that I was naive. But I don't think that's true. I think he was a person who found himself standing in front of something, a document, a dollar amount, a door that had been left unlocked, and he made the wrong call. And then he made another one. And another, until the distance between a brother I knew and the thing he became was so large I couldn't see across it anymore. What I've learned. What I actually believe now, not as a comfort but as something I've tested against the wreckage of the last year, is that your character isn't what you claim it is. It's what you do when no one is watching and the stakes are real. Scott cried real tears at our mother's funeral. I believe that. I also believe he was in her closet 72 hours later. Both things are true. And the second one is the one that mattered. Franklin told me something in that courtyard that I've turned over in my mind 100 times since. He said the people who hurt us most are usually the ones who stopped asking themselves hard questions. That the moment a person decides their need is more important than another person's dignity, they've already lost something they can't buy back. I think about that when I think about what I want my own life to look like. Not the inheritance, not the legal outcome, just the daily, unglamorous work of being someone who asks the hard questions. Who tells the truth when lying would be easier? Who doesn't open lockboxes that aren't hers to open? I had to fight to stay clear-headed through all of it. There were weeks where I wanted to collapse into the story of myself as a victim and just live there because victimhood has its own kind of comfort. It asks nothing of you. My therapist wouldn't let me. She kept redirecting me back to what I could control, what I could choose, what I could build. It was infuriating and it was exactly right. The locket is still around my neck. I haven't taken it off. My mother wore it for 30 years without knowing what it might unlock. She kept faith with something she couldn't fully see. I think that's the thing I want to carry forward. Not the money, not even the grandfather I'm slowly learning to know. Just that. The willingness to keep something safe even when you don't fully understand its value yet. She knew it was worth something. She gave it to me anyway. I'm trying to be worthy of that.